This is Florida Gulf Coast University.
The virus that causes dengue fever has been gone from the U.S. since the 1940s, but there are still as many as 100 million infections a year elsewhere in the world. Now dengue has reappeared in the U.S. in the Florida Keys. Should we be concerned? What, if anything, can be done? We'll hear from experts on the dengue virus, including their work towards a first-of-a-kind vaccine, on this episode of FGCU Perspectives. Our guests: Scott Michael, a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at FGCU and a member of the university's Biotechnology Research Group, and Sharon Isern, an associate professor in FGCU's Department of Biological Sciences and also a member of its Biotechnology Research Group. I have to confess to both of you that when the news stories first started coming out about the recent outbreak in Key West, I wasn't aware that dengue still existed in the world, but it apparently is a terrible issue elsewhere.
There are approximately 2.5 billion people at risk of getting dengue virus infection. About 100 million are infected annually. And of those, about 500,000 develop the more severe dengue hemorrhagic fever, dengue shock syndrome. And of those, up to 25,000 die annually, most of them children.
Scott, my situation of not being aware of the disease's existence is probably mostly because it just hasn't been here in Florida in the U.S.
Right, not in the United States for quite some time. The last time there was ongoing transmission in Florida was about 75 years ago. So it hasn't been here in a while, and it's been out of our sight. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't been around in the world. Dengue has some origins probably in the tropical parts of Africa or Southeast Asia, and seems to have spread with human colonization of the New World and really globally.
And it's a disease confined to the tropics?
It's found wherever the mosquitoes are found.
Okay.
And it can only be acquired from a mosquito, so you can't get it from human to human.
So tell me about the virus itself. What happens if somebody contracts dengue fever?
So there are actually 4 different forms of the virus. These are called serotypes. And so if you get infected with the first one, you develop high onset fever, very similar to what you get with influenza. You get severe headache, pain behind the eyes, and eventually just really bad muscle aches, bone aches, and hence the nickname breakbone fever. Beyond that, and that's what most people get if they do get infected. Beyond that, you can develop hemorrhagic symptoms. That's the dengue hemorrhagic fever and eventual shock and death.
And hemorrhagic symptoms?
So basically, it's the blood vessels start to leak, and the fluid goes into other parts of the body, and the body needs to adjust to that. So the only treatment for it is fluid replacement therapy.
And only spread through mosquitoes?
Only spread through mosquitoes and particular kinds of mosquitoes. So the main vector, which these mosquitoes are called, is the species called Aedes aegypti. And Aedes aegypti is an urban mosquito. So it travels with us in our garbage and breeds in the things we leave outside that collect rainwater. And so these are the mosquitoes that bite you in your bathroom and on your lanai. They're not the ones that you find out in the swamps. They're the ones that you find around human habitation.
And tell me about the situation in Key West right now then.
Well, the situation in Key West is that for some reason, and that's currently not known, the mosquitoes and the virus and the humans have come together, and the virus is now being transmitted through local mosquito populations into people who live in Key West. Now, there are usually a lot of travelers who come back from dengue endemic countries in the tropics who may have been exposed, and they bring the virus with them.
So that's not unusual?
Not unusual at all. As a matter of fact, there are probably somewhere in the 40 to 50 cases already this year of people who had traveled outside of Florida, picked up dengue and brought it back to Florida, but it hasn't gone anywhere. The difference in Key West is that it's now in the mosquito populations and being transmitted locally.
And that hasn't happened. That's what we're talking about when...
That hasn't happened in 75 years.
Right.
So the last outbreak in Key West was in 1934.
So numbers in the dozens, I guess, so far this year in Key West?
I think by mid-July, maybe up to 24, and that is ongoing.
Is that a number that causes folks like you concern?
Yes, because once a person gets infected with a mosquito, that person can get bitten by a mosquito and then transmit it to other people. And so the fact that the current mosquito control methods are not eradicating completely the mosquito population leads us to believe that there could be potential spread from the Keys to other parts of Florida and southern states.
The mosquito control people are doing a great job, but there's that fear of an epidemic, and you can describe this best as a hockey stick graph. So if you get one person bitten by one mosquito and then that mosquito goes and bites one other person, that can kind of simmer for a while. But then if you get that mosquito biting multiple people and then multiple mosquitoes biting that person, then the situation really gets out of control, and you could very, very quickly start to see large numbers of people who are infected.
So they're on top of it in the Keys. You've talked to the mosquito control folks down there. What are they watching for? More reports of
they're watching.
illness?
They're getting reports from human cases, and something that we're collaborating with them is they collect mosquitoes from Key West and ship them up here to FGCU, where we test to see if the mosquitoes have been infected by dengue virus. And based on what we tell them, they can go back to those locations and spray more heavily and eradicate the mosquito populations.
So that in an effort to stay out of the situation that you're talking about in other parts of the tropics. What is the situation elsewhere when we talk about the places where it is, you use the term scientifically, epidemic. What does that mean when it's epidemic in an area?
Well, there's kind of two words that you use, and I don't want to get too much in the details. One is this term endemic, and that means that it's locally transmitted. And then epidemic means that it's locally transmitted and getting out of hand. So it's pretty easy to shut down an epidemic that's going gung-ho if you really have good mosquito control. But it's almost impossible to eradicate the virus from the mosquitoes because you can't really get rid of the mosquitoes completely from most tropical areas. And that's what people are worried about here. These mosquitoes that transmit this virus are now established all along the Gulf Coast of the United States, up the Atlantic seaboard, and during the summers when the winters are mild, and then over the subsequent summers, these mosquitoes actually colonize other northern cities. And so dengue originally was described from the New World from Philadelphia. And it could get there again if we don't do anything about it.
And these mosquitoes you talk about are not necessarily mosquitoes that are carrying the disease, they're mosquitoes that are capable of carrying it.
Yes. And so you need all the three components. You need the infectable humans, you need the mosquito vectors, and then you need the virus to show up.
Now, some of the diseases that we talk about, that mosquitoes carrying, go through other animals other than humans. Does this go to horses or birds?
No, as far as it's understood, it's just between humans and mosquitoes. There does not appear to be another animal host.
But there are enough humans, as you said, urban mosquitoes, there's enough humans in urban areas.
Correct.
More and more all the time.
To make that spread happen.
Right.
People die from it. It's not a terribly likely thing to happen. Is that?
No, not terribly likely. If you do get infected, maybe 1 to 10% incidence of death.
And you have told me that it's infants.
Infants seem to appear to be the most increased fatality so far. The reason for that is that in utero, infants get antibodies from their mothers through the placenta. And so they start off their life with already a repertoire of antibodies against dengue. And in most endemic countries, most mothers will have been infected at one time or another. So what happens is if the infants later on in life, this is pretty much early in their development, get infected by a different or even the same strain or form of the virus, they may actually develop more severe symptoms because
So the antibodies do not work in your favor?
They don't work because it's a matter of you can either get protection if you have antibodies, or sometimes you can get an increased incidence of worse disease, and it depends on how much of the antibody you have. Sometimes it makes it better, sometimes not as good. And so what happens with infants, it's there, and people don't really understand what the threshold amount of antibodies that someone needs to have before they're fully protected.
But the second infection is the one where you get the
Right.
bone break fever,
Right.
as you called it.
Right.
There's an interesting bit of biology going on here in that there's 4 types of dengue virus. And any one particular dengue virus, if you get infected with that, will leave you with an antibody response that usually protects you for the rest of your life against that one
particular
kind.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get infected with any of the other 3, usually your symptoms are worse. So that makes vaccines very difficult, because if your vaccine doesn't protect you completely against all 4 kinds, or if the antibodies fall off over time, as they often do with vaccines, then you really may end up making people sicker by giving them a vaccine.
And vaccines, for something that is as prevalent as this virus is, I was surprised to learn that there are no vaccines, no treatments.
No vaccines, no treatments, no drugs. Mm-hmm.
Particularly problematic? I mean, it's a little devil to attack.
You can imagine as a company setting out to make a vaccine that you wouldn't want to make a product that might make people sicker. And so there's been a tremendous amount of reluctance on the part of the pharmaceutical industry to develop these things. So there are several vaccines that are now undergoing clinical trials. These have been developed by the United States Navy or the National Institutes of Health, primarily to protect warfighters overseas. Also, some other countries have developed similar vaccines. In Thailand, I think there's a clinical trial going on for one of their vaccines. And these vaccines may very well work. However, they're based on the whole virus. And we know that the whole virus, if you get infected with the whole virus, which of course you do, you are then set up for this enhancement of disease effect. And so these vaccines that use the whole virus may very well just set people up for the worst disease possible. And one of the things that we're working on is understanding the details of the antibody response in patients. And so our laboratory isolates specific individual antibodies and characterizes them. And what our idea is that we'd like to find out which antibodies protect you, which antibodies make the disease worse, and if you could then make a vaccine by leaving out the parts of the virus that would generate antibodies that would make you sicker, and only include those parts of the vaccine, of the virus in the vaccine, that would make you protected.
And Sharon, we're talking about this because of the situation in Key West and proximity to us here in Southwest Florida. But this research isn't something you're doing in response to that. It's something you've been doing for years.
No, we've been here since 2004, and we're working on it a few years before that, so 6-7 years that we've been working on it. It's something that's true and dear to my heart. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and dengue virus has been endemic in Puerto Rico, so it's something that I grew up with and something that I always thought was important to study.
And the reason that it's there's not a medical solution to the problem, and that you're getting closer to it today. Technology is better. Technology is faster. Is that a part of the sort of answer to the?
There's more rapid ways to do diagnosis, there's better technology, but there's still, dengue virus is considered one of those neglected tropical diseases. It's not something that our government is putting a lot of funding into, because in the past it has been a disease of other countries, not the US, not Europe, and so there hasn't really been that much importance placed on doing research in this particular type of virus.
I smile when you say neglected tropical diseases, because you told me there's a journal by that name.
Yes, yeah, we have recently just published in that journal. So.
And those other neglected tropical diseases might include?
Malaria, yellow fever, St. Louis encephalitis, all these different things that happen typically in third world countries.
And the neglect then that they get, if you can get neglect, helps create the situation where viruses are hard to come by, treatments are hard to come by, because there's not this hue and cry to get a solution for them.
Right. And in fact, it's an economic issue as well, because if you have a pathogen that's primarily a problem in a developing country, oftentimes there isn't the patient base to make it profitable for a company to develop a vaccine or an inhibitor.
The patient base with income, with
Exactly.
health insurance, with...
Right. It doesn't make economic sense to develop a drug to treat people who don't have the ability to pay for it.
is a part of the solution. You know, you're approaching this from a medical situation and treating somebody who is infected. Is a part of the solution better control of the vector, the mosquito?
That is one solution, and I think that is probably the most effective solution that we have out there, as there are no drugs to treat it. Another of the projects that we're working on is to develop drugs to prevent viruses from infecting other cells. So once you get infected, how do you prevent the virus from spreading and for what we call the virus load from increasing in your body? And we have a basic interest in the research as far as understanding how dengue virus enters a cell. And so by understanding this process, we have used this to define better ways of blocking entry into a cell, so blocking virus entry into the cell. So that's one of the things that we're currently working on.
Is that done to stave off other viruses other than dengue? Are there drugs that do that?
Yes, actually I was thinking of influenza, but Tamiflu actually blocks influenza virus from exiting a cell as opposed to entering the cell. So the cell will already be infected, but it's prevented from spreading to neighboring cells. We're working on antivirals that prevent the virus from entering the first cell.
So not only is there not an existing vaccine or something to prevent you from becoming sick, once you're sick, there's not really a treatment either.
Right. So there's very little you can do about this. And so by saying that mosquito control is one of the best mechanisms of defense, absolutely, but at this point it's our only mechanism of defense. And that's really not where we want to be with these sorts of organisms.
Are there efforts underway to try and control the mosquitoes in a sort of more aggressive way, or are we at our best?
I think we're at best right now.
Well, mosquito control is trying some new things. So for example, the Keys Mosquito Control is putting out new cups. So what they do is they'll put out cups in the neighborhood with that look very nice and attractive to a female mosquito, and then she'll come and lay her eggs in there, but the water in the cup is laced with a toxin that kills the larva. So there are some new technologies that they're trying, but these are not established technologies. Primarily they still rely on fogging or larvicides that they add to the water, or simply tipping over the containers that might be in people's yards. We had better mosquito control when we used more environmentally damaging insecticides.
So back in the days of DDT or...
Right. Mm-hmm. However, you know, there's a trade-off, and that trade-off is pretty clear to see. Do you want to kill the mosquitoes at the expense of killing everything else in the environment with them? Or do you want to live with some of these potential pathogens and still have an intact environment? And those are questions we need to weigh.
Sharon, as you talk with the folks in the Keys, obviously there's interest in knowing about the people who have been infected, but you're also looking at the mosquitoes themselves to see what you can see about what they're carrying. Right,
so what we're doing is we're identifying if mosquitoes are infected with the virus. And if they're infected, we also want to look at the genomic makeup of the virus itself. So in other words, we're trying to figure out what does the virus look like so that we can then compare that virus to other viruses out there and figure out maybe the entry into the United States. What is it most closely related to? Is it related to a mosquito in Mexico, Central America, somewhere in the Caribbean, or is it something that came from Asia and flew in a plane and got infected somebody in Key West? So we're looking at the genetics of the actual virus that is being carried by the mosquitoes to determine where it came from.
And you're able to report back, you said, with some almost real-time...
Real-time surveillance. So as they send us samples, we process them in the laboratory and identify whether we have any positive hits, and we tell them, and we know exactly which location they came from, and they can go back and treat those areas more heavily.
One of the questions we asked at the beginning of the program was, you know, should we be concerned, and what, if anything, can we do? Is there anything that we should be watching for here in our little part of the world?
In Southwest Florida. Yes, we should be watching to see if it gets out of the Keys or if the mosquito control program is able to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. If we're not able to get rid of it, it is either likely to simmer or to spread. And it's not clear what's going to cause it to do that. That's going to be flipping a coin. We don't know where it's going to go, if it goes anywhere. We don't know when it's going to happen, if it does happen. And so I think a certain amount of vigilance is going to be important, watching looking for clinical signs, looking for patients, diagnosing them, reporting them, and looking in the mosquito populations and seeing if it's spreading in the mosquito populations.
Has there been an instance in a country, like the U.S., where it's been gone for decades, where it has come in and taken over, or has come in and not?
Actually, Hawaii in 2005, there was an outbreak of dengue, and it went away after a little while. So it can go away. But again, it's an island, so it's a lot more isolated. Florida, we have transportation routes and commerce that may help with the spread.
Right.
And tourism, you hate to talk about
Right.
it, but that would certainly be a spreader.
Absolutely. And in other places in the world where dengue gets established, it's very difficult to get rid of. There are other island countries. Singapore is a really good example, where they get an influx of dengue from the surrounding countries in Asia. And even though they have excellent mosquito control, they just simply have enough introductions that it's there all the time. And anytime they get rid of it, they get a new one in some period of time.
Is the work that you're doing on the antibodies, is it something that could be translatable to other viruses?
Certainly, yeah.
It's not so hyper-specific
So dengue virus is of the flavivirus family, which is related to yellow fever, West Nile, and so there are other members of that clade that the same sorts of techniques and principles can apply to.
How here on campus, how are the students brought into this part of the work?
We have quite a bit, so we take on students into the laboratory working on independent studies, doing their honors research projects. A lot of them stay on an additional year before, say, applying to medical school or graduate school and continue working in the lab. So we have a lot of student involvement in the lab. They become authors in publications as well. So.
And you bring it into the cell biology course that you're going to be teaching this fall, and as well as the virology course that you're teaching. Mm-hmm. So
there's no separation between teaching and research. It actually is combined.
Right.
And the facility, brag about it a little bit.
Well, we just got a new building built, AB7, Academic Building 7, and included in the third floor design is what's called a biosafety facility. And the biosafety facility has negative air pressure, so even though dengue is not transmitted airborne, we could potentially work with other airborne pathogens in this facility. So it's set up very nicely to be able to do a wide variety of work similar to this. And that's where we do our dengue virus research. It's a great laboratory. We have all the facilities we need. We have great equipment here. In many cases, newer and better equipment than other established research-intensive universities. So we do pretty well here. We're in good shape.
Now, I said that the work you're doing could lead to a first of its kind vaccine. What's next? I mean, something tells me this is not a next week kind of project.
Definitely this is a long-term kind of project. We're looking at the basic biology of how to develop a vaccine, so understanding the antibodies that are helpful towards a vaccine development versus the ones that could be hurtful. And so we're talking several years downstream, but this is going to help also other vaccine efforts as well, understanding the basic biology of dengue virus infection in a human patient. The
paper you said you had just published in the Neglected Tropical Diseases Journal. What was the nature of that? Was it about
this was about the actually this was the antiviral.
Right. These are inhibitors, and what these inhibitors do. We work with a variety of collaborators, and one of our collaborators has helped us to predict on a computer molecules that would stick to the outer surface of the virus and gum up its ability to enter the next cell. And that's exactly what we found. When we looked at these things, we built them. They inhibit the virus from getting into the next cell. They bind to the outer surface proteins of the virus. And if you take electron micrograph pictures of the virions themselves, their outer surface coating is all messed up. So we have the ability to go in there and, at a molecular level, design our own drugs that are going to interfere with the virus life cycle.
This would be a good thing.
I think so. I think so. They're very small, they're very tricky, but we can go in there and poke them.
Is the next step then, how far away is putting this into some type of, you called it a trial, to where you're...
There are no, so the normal way that different drugs go into development, they go first from in vitro, work in the laboratory in petri dishes, to animal models. The thing about dengue is there are no really good animal models out there that actually mimic the human disease. And so you can, for example, try a monkey model or a mouse model, but they're not going to develop the same disease symptoms. And so the only way
Where if you were studying another disease, a monkey gets it exactly the same way.
You would probably
Right,
start with a smaller vertebrate. You'd start with maybe a mouse and then move up to the monkey, but you can't really do that with dengue virus. So anything that's developed in vitro pretty much needs to take the next big leap of faith and go into safety, efficacy, human clinical trials.
Are you enjoying the attention to your work that might not have been paid prior to this news in Key West? Enjoy might not be the right word. But.
No, this is a disease that harms people. It destroys people's lives. It kills people, and our projects are designed to help alleviate that. And so the fact that it's in the United States again is certainly raising awareness, and that may be a good thing. But in terms of what we do, we've always had the idea that we would help develop better vaccines, and we would help develop new and better inhibitors and get rid of this thing. We want to put ourselves out of business.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That is our program for today. I want to thank both of you for being here, and thank you for watching this edition of FGCU Perspectives.